Well, I think they're doing pretty well now. I mean, I think they were a little bit on slow off the starting blocks, and I think that's partly moving to remote working. I think there was initially a lack of clarity from central government about exactly what local government would be doing in terms of support for business and things. So once the Chancellor started announcing business packages, there was a bit of a lack of clarity about how local government would deliver those. That's settled down now. You're not seeing, obviously, a lot of local government coverage nationally unless something goes wrong, which it fortunately hasn't, particularly for local government. What you are seeing at a local level is a lot of very close working with the BBC, naturally, because trusted voice comes very much into play at this time. So you've got local government teams working closely with their BBC stations, particularly radio. Again, as we would in warming and informing, getting messages out to vulnerable people. BBC Radio obviously has still got a crucial role to play with that, particularly getting to those citizens who aren't online and on social. Although obviously we've seen growing numbers of older people on social and people from less affluent communities, and that has lifted again during this crisis. So a lot of people who perhaps weren't online are going online for information. So that's generally been working quite well. They've been using a lot of Twitter and Facebook, and a lot of local authorities have been joining into community Facebook groups that are pre-existing community groups, and talking with the administrators of those groups to get their messaging out into the groups.
And that, if you like, community up rather than sort of local government down approach is quite sort of unusual. Local government comms people have fretted about that in the past, haven't they? Because they see, you know, the message, the control of the message potentially being lost. Is that just a pragmatic response? Because, hey, those community groups on, let's say, Facebook have got a kind of pre-existing audience that's valuable to tap into? Has there been a kind of a deep breath and a let's plunge in kind of to this bottom-up social approach?
I think it's been a recognition of some of the experience from flooding that's come out more recently. A number of local authority areas, when they were hit with flooding over the last year or so, have really positively tapped into those community groups, created good relationships with the administrators of those groups so that they can put messaging in where it's needed, but are seen to be a valuable partner rather than top-down telling people. Because I think it's a recognition that local authority Facebook pages reach a certain number of people, but there are huge community groups out there set up by community activists. They have large following, they're active, and by inputting into those groups, you get a much more effective discussion and you get the right message to the right people. So I think the learning from flooding, from incidents, is now really bearing fruit, and people are finding that is working really well for them.
And I wonder to what extent that sort of tapping into pre-existing community groups will continue, you know, after COVID-19. It continued a bit perhaps after, as you say, the flooding. Is it here to stay, or do you think local government comms will kind of revert to the way it used to, with a slightly more kind of top-down approach than perhaps is happening at the moment?
Well, I'm hoping it will be much more of a point of engagement rather than, as you say, broadcast top-down communications, because I think that's the way local government will build much more sustainable relationships with their communities and be seen as more of a trusted partner rather than an authoritarian telling people how it is. And I think for some councils that will come naturally. For others, that's going to be a bit of a shift in their approach and style.
In particular, perhaps elected members feel a little bit frightened of this community approach, because they worry that within those communities are, their political opposition. So perhaps there's a difference between elected members and officers in local government to that extent.
I think it varies very much from authority to authority. I mean, I think where members have had plenty of support around social and digital, they've had opportunities to learn, they've had effective support from their communications teams. That's where I see members quite keen to jump in. They're active in their community groups anyway, as part of their ward work. And where they've had advice to separate their political campaigning from their ward work and keep the two fairly separate, then they can be really effective in those communities. And it doesn't matter if there are members with different political views within a community group, as long as they don't start having political arguments within that space. And I think that's a sense of, we're getting a lot of new members coming in, a lot of members with more digital and social skills, and they're finding that more comfortable than perhaps members traditionally have.
One of the things you've been doing in your work for the Chartered Institute of PR is to listen to how messages actually land within the communities that they're targeted at. What has been, if anything, the lesson thus far in the coronavirus pandemic?
I think the lessons that have been coming out, because we've been, I have a number of colleagues who've been working with me trying to listen across communities and across different areas of the UK and the nations. What we're seeing is that some of the basic principles, clear messages, really good clear graphics play really well. Video content works well when it's done appropriately with short pieces of video. Managing the tone is really, really important, and understanding when your tone is slightly off and adjusting it. And that's where we've seen across all public sector comms a few misfires. So there have been incidences with police, with health, with fire, pretty much with every public sector organisation as well as government, where the tone hasn't come across right. And it's being alert to that tone not landing correctly and adjusting it rather than carrying on in the same vein.
And can you give me an example of how tonally it's been wrong occasionally?
Well, I think, in the early days of the crisis, we were seeing some of the NHS trusts using things like TikTok to show their staff all pulling together, which was fine at that point. But there comes a point when you've got people who've died, and it becomes less appropriate to have jolly groups of staff dancing around. The tone needs to change to reflect the seriousness of the situation. Equally, police have had some issues with the tone. It is a case of police working with communities, and when the tone has come across a bit overzealous, that hasn't played well with communities. And again, forces need to be alert to that, and we've tried to feed that back when that's happening.
And if the tone is sort of too authoritarian, that, I guess, is counterproductive. People rail against that overly zealous tone and don't stay at home over Easter or whatever. But what you've pointed out here is the importance of listening, that communications have always been two-way. And if you're not listening to the information, to the feedback coming back in the opposite direction, you can't nuance the tone or the content of the message accordingly, and you can end up getting it wrong as a consequence.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge probably for particularly local public sector communicators, so NHS trusts, police, fire and local government, is that they are short on resources, particularly on communications resources. So they're managing to get their messaging out, managing to broadcast, managing to access channels and reach people, but having the capacity and the tools to also effectively listen to how things are playing out, to be able to rebut things when they're not quite right, that is a real challenge for teams, particularly when you've got in many districts teams of one or two. You know, it is asking a lot of people to actually be able to do that. So that's why we're, as the CIPR Local Public Services Committee, trying to help by doing some of that listening and feeding that back.
Although the feedback circuit, if you like, in social media in particular, is very, very quick. And if you do get something wrong, it's the very people you're trying to communicate with who tell you you've got it wrong. So I guess there is a kind of self-healing element to social media, although sometimes it doesn't feel like healing. It feels like you're at the center of a Twitter firestorm, for example, for getting the tone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very much feel for those communicators where perhaps they've advised on a different approach or tone. So sometimes some of the misfires haven't come from the central communications teams. They've come where they've got a number of Twitter or Facebook channels, and you've empowered individuals at a more service delivery level, and they've not quite got it right. That can be particularly challenging.
In the old command and control days, of course, it was one way in, one way out of an organization. Social media tools, the ubiquity of our mobile phones means we can sort of reach out to our audiences pretty much anytime, anywhere, any place, and that in itself brings a challenge, doesn't it? I'm sure media managers have many sleepless nights because of that as a consequence.
Well, I think it shows the organisations that have invested in their staff. So the comms teams who have looked across their organisations, worked with different services, helped service managers to understand how social and digital channels work, and have put in that time and effort on training staff right across the organisation. That's where it shows. Those who've very much gone to a restricted, it's only the central team who do all the work and haven't spent the time with their colleagues, that's where you see the problems starting, because this isn't a command and control environment, as you say. Social and digital is very much a two-way engagement.
Final question, Mandy. Do you think it's possible that we might, and I'm clutching for straws here, looking for silver linings, whatever the metaphor is, mixing them hopelessly, is there a possibility at least that local government comms, media, PR, sort of comms more generally, comes out of this in a stronger, in a more robust place, having learned a lot of very harsh lessons in this time of incredible change? I mean, I think about my own company, ACM Training. We've done probably more in 3 or 4 weeks than we would have done in 4 or 5 years if we would have been, doing things at the normal pace. So out of the kind of crucible, do you think comes some good in local government comms?
Yeah, I think there's a number of positives. I mean, I think one is often it's been observed that organisations who've gone through a crisis, out of it comes a recognition by senior management of the value of strategic communications. And that tends to happen on a crisis, but it tends to be individual to an authority. So this is giving a crisis across all authorities. So hopefully that will bring a recognition amongst senior management teams to the critical role that communications provides. I think for teams themselves, they were already well on the road to dispersed working, to more flexible working, to be out and about, to be more video journalists, and I think that will continue. And I think in terms of building engagement with communities, I think there's a real opportunity to strengthen and develop those relationships with communities, both digitally and when we go back to more normal working on a more face-to-face level. And that's got to be good for trust in local government and trust in communications.
Sorry, just one final addendum. I wonder whether there isn't a concern that local government, when it has to do all of the service delivery to pick up the pieces of the coronavirus pandemic, won't suddenly find itself in a different kind of austerity mode, and that comms will be underinvested in as a consequence. It will be seen as a kind of drag on an organisation's bottom line, and rather than an investment. Is there a slight concern in the back of your mind around that?
I think there's a danger for local government generally that obviously the Chancellor's put a lot of money into the economy, but at some point there's going to be a payback for that. And local government has taken the brunt of 10 years of austerity. I think, there's a concern that there will be more austerity for local government. I'm hoping that senior management teams, having seen the value of their strategic communications, both internally and externally in a crisis, will recognise that any more cutting back of communications is likely to be counterproductive for local government. I mean, I think you'll see the organisations where they have cut their communications to the bare minimum are the ones that are really, really struggling at the moment. So when you see the sort of star performers, shall we say, in this, it tends to be the Liverpools, the Bristols, Bournemouth, Newcastle, some of the big cities where they've still got relatively robust communications teams. Where you see people struggling, it's the smaller districts with one or two people. It only needs that one person to be ill, and suddenly you've just lost all your communications capacity. And I hope strategic management teams will see the risk that presents and not be tempted, if there's further austerity, to make any more cutbacks on communications.